Test, test, test. You guys can hear me okay? All right. So this room's a little bit bigger than yesterday. Yesterday I lost my voice at the end of the day. So today I'm just going to talk about a very dry topic. So we'll get through it, but I'm going to try to ask a lot of questions of the audience just to get a feel for kind of what you guys are doing, where you're at. Some of you I trained yesterday, or we conversed yesterday about OpenAPI and different things that you guys are doing. From a practice perspective, I work as kind of the East Coast arm of a company called cPrime. Recently acquired this past January after running our own, my wife and I ran our own IT company for about 10 years, which is a slog if you've never had your own company. So now it's a little bit easier. I can just work with customers and help them do various DevOps types of activities or API-related activities. So that's an interesting picture. I'm not sure where that came from. Okay, let's go forward. Let's see if that works, and if it doesn't, you go to the next slide for me, that would be great. I can't even tell where that is. Where is that? Okay, something's going on here now. All right, so I'll give my marketing pitch as we're waiting. There we go, okay. So my marketing pitch is working for a company called cPrime based in California. I'm here in Fall River, Massachusetts, now moving to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Been working with the SmartBear folks for a long time. Ule and their team formerly was Everywhere and then is now SmartBear with SOAP UI since back in the day. I can't even remember how long now. And then through that relationship, got a chance to meet with Tony Tam. There was an interest and need to develop training like we have been doing with SOAP UI, but now with Swagger and now OpenAPI. As part of that, interacted with Lorinda and a variety of other people in the ecosystem. So I want to kind of share a little bit about 3.0 and how it fits with different styles that people build out there. The majority of what I'm seeing in the field, as I mentioned yesterday, is level 2. That's where most people are at. And level 3, we heard some people yesterday talking about that. They are at that. And can OpenAPI support that? And the short answer is kind of. So we'll kind of go through each of those. My background prior to that is I worked for Cape Clear Software, which is now Workday. Probably heard of them. Got a chance to work with some great people like Henri O'Toole and others in the middleware space for many years. And now just kind of helping clients. Capital One was one of them. Just was there recently helping them down in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so I'm just going to point, if you guys can go to the next slide. We'll start off with the first one. What the heck is this Richardson Maturity model to begin with? Where I'll click. There we go. Okay. So as a person that's been developing SOAP services for a long time, I was really comfortable with WSDL, really comfortable with XML schema, and then REST started popping up at companies like Pearson, where I was embedded doing middleware. And the question was, hey, REST versus SOAP, which do we do? So this was back in 2007. I'm like, SOAP, it's got everything you need. It's got 50 standards, we can do everything. But as time went on, you started realizing that there's another world outside of the back end, and that is the front end, the UI, the mobile experiences. So as part of that, I'm trying to figure out, okay, as somebody that's moving towards REST, how do I categorize where I'm at and where we want to go? And Richardson Maturity Model is a mechanism by which we can take a look at that. And as we heard earlier, Martin Fowler, I think a lot of people read about his stuff or get introduced about things from him and his blog posts and the ThoughtWorks guys and gals. So really, it's a way to categorize. Where are you from a maturity level? Are you doing something that is really old school, or are you way on the far end where Roy Fielding in his dissertation identified as, hey, the server is going to interact with you and you're going to be dynamically interacting with it. Just like I'm talking with you. If we had a conversation, you don't know what I'm going to say. Likewise, I don't know what you're going to say. We have to know how to interact. And software isn't really good at that. That's a challenge. Maybe AI will help with that over time. So as we get to level 3, it's more complicated. So we're going to talk about different levels from simple to complex. And we'll start off in the world that I really started with, which is level 0. So SOAP services, XML RPC. In terms of my development, it started like in '93, so I'm on the older side in comparison to maybe some of you. SOAP, Corba, those types of technologies, we're really focused on trying to drill and invoke remote procedures over the internet or in the network. So you have like, in this particular case, you've got some kind of HTTP communication, but it's really dumbed down in that we're going to one location, a single endpoint. We're only doing a post. So we have all this rich language. It's like me talking about one thing repetitively. There's not a lot of interesting things going on in that. I can't talk about gets or puts or deletes, et cetera. It's just a post. And then the example that we quite often see are payloads, and the payloads really describe what it is that you want to do. So in the world of SOAP, you would spend a lot of time in defining your XML schema, and in the XML schema, you would maybe wrap it with a root element that said, hey, this is a get customer, or this is this type of activity. So very RPC in nature. So in this particular case, we've got organizations that still to this day have a lot of SOAP services and are doing something analogous to this. So if you were SOAP-based and you're using like Oracle Fusion middleware and BPEL and other languages like that, you're probably at level 0. It's not a bad thing, it's just that's where you're at. You're not taking advantage of maybe some of the more advanced capabilities. And as we move towards the higher levels, we get more conversant. We're talking more in a dynamic way. So in terms of OpenAPI, can we support it? Yeah, but would you really want to do this? Do you really want to do WSDL and OpenAPI, or SOAP-based communications in OpenAPI? Probably not, but technically if we look at it, you could say, okay, we have a singular endpoint, that's it. There's a single URI, and you're doing a post. That's it. There's really nothing exciting going on there. And then on the response side, you probably just have a 200 OK. So you're not really taking advantage of the wide range of response codes that can really articulate more about what's going on. It's very simplistic, in, out, invoking some kind of remote procedure call. So this is a 3.0 example. So we talked about 3.0. And in here, you'll see that there's a request body. So if you haven't seen that before, that's a new capability in comparison to the 2.0 Swagger spec. So then we move on, or try to move on. There we go. Level 1. So now we're getting to this notion of, okay, rather than having like a singular service that does everything, and then trying to have the data tell you what all the things are that you want to do, you start moving more towards the creation of individual resources or destinations. And those destinations are effectively identified through the URI. So if you took the class yesterday, we talked about how the URI identifies where in the network the resource is located. So HTTP, the protocol, but also the URI, that's the second component of REST that we want to leverage. So it allows us to route the request to a proper resource. So now I can have a claim API, I can have a customer API, as Lorinda talked about, identity APIs, not one Mongo service or God service, individual, more clearly defined context that we can invoke. But still, I'm limited to the verb. I'm using post. Okay, so it's not really conversing again. I'm just kind of posting. I'm just redirecting to different locations based on the resource I want to interact with. And then the data has to try to define what is it that I want to do in this. So it's okay, but I think the real world, if we take a look at this, this would be an example in OpenAPI. So you have two separate definitions, different paths in this particular case are persons and a claims. I typically build, per resource, I build a different Swagger doc that goes with that. So these are examples of that. But I think most people are probably at level 2, and this is kind of where I stay, because level 3, there's some assumptions, and we'll talk to those. So level 2, now we've got verbs. So now I can say get, I can say patch, post, delete. So now I'm actually interacting with the resource and using some of these methods to identify the kind of conversation I want to have. I can also take advantage of idempotent operations. So, hey, if this thing, if it already exists, don't create it, right? If I do a get, every single time I do a get, I know I'm going to get the same response every single time. It's consistent. It's idempotent in terms of execution. It's not modifying the resource state. So standardized list of operations, as well as response codes. So now I've got a wide range of response codes that can articulate. So there's one example is working with Barnes & Noble, and we had a team that wanted to use the Play framework. Have never used it, didn't know anything about it. It was just, hey, this is a new technology. We're going to go ahead and build our front end in the Play framework. And then I got tasked with, hey, here's Oracle Fusion middleware, and you got to go build some type of API layer. I'm like, not the best tool to be using to build APIs, but that's what we were selected with. So where we started with, and I mentioned this yesterday, was we started with trying to figure out, well, what is the contract? This is before Swagger was really dominant. It was more in the days of the competition between probably Waddle, I guess, would be the closest thing that was out there. So this is in the earlier 2000 timeframe. and trying to say, okay, what is the REST API definition that we want to create? And what we did was we said, we're going to use Confluence from Atlassian, and we're going to define it. We're going to agree on it both on the architectural side. So I was the architect for the back end. There's an architect for the front end. We created the definition, and that became a single point of truth. And as we're going through that, one of the things that we wanted to figure out, because I was a SOAP guy, I was like, well, do we need to return anything other than a 200? And he's like, yeah, we want to have some good dialogue here. I want to know that you're doing a delete, so maybe let's do a 204. Or if it doesn't exist, I want a 404. So it was kind of the first time I got exposed to the richness of the response and how that can help from a maturity level with defining good REST APIs, as well as the verbs, as well as the URI naming convention, along with the structure of the data. And once we had that kind of well-defined, that definition phase, as kind of was mentioned earlier, we went through the process of actually doing a prototype. So now I went off and built the Oracle Fusion middleware stuff in OSB. They went off and Play Framework World, and we then connected. And it connected very easily and simply because we had agreed upon that. And that's one of the values that kind of hammered through on OpenAPI, if you haven't used it, is an agreement on what it is that it's going to do in advance of actually developing or deploying. So in that case, level 2 maturity, this is where I see most people. I don't know if, raise the hands, is this where most of you guys are at if you were building REST APIs? So one hand, Lorinda. Okay. How about 3, level 3? We're going to get to that in a second, but so we've got a few guys I know from the training yesterday that were talking about level 3. So this was an interesting area as I was kind of researching. So here's the 2, just to kind of encapsulate it. You got a get and a post. You've got some responses. You're taking advantage of more of the capabilities of the HTTP protocol. And then we move on to the level 3. And in level 3, it's really around dynamic discoverability or using the hypermedia responses and the information that comes back to then determine what I'm going to do next. So level 3 maturity, this is kind of, you're now at the point of using hypermedia as the engine of states, and you're effectively leveraging the request and response to then direct you to the next phase. So yesterday we talked about like an airline reservation. So maybe the first thing you do is you log in or you register yourself on American Airlines. Once you're there, you kind of pick the route that you want to go. That's another activity. Then you go ahead and book the ticket, and then you pick the seat, and then you're done, and you pay, right? So there's a series of activities that can happen. So in the old days, I would have built a BPEL process and used SOAP services and kind of created this workflow, this business process. But in the new world, if I'm using level 3, I can create it via a series of interactions back and forth from a series of dynamic endpoints or services. So first service I invoke to log in comes back and tells me where to go next. But I have to be cognizant of that information. And that's the crux of the challenge right now with OpenAPI is that, yeah, we can do that, but we have to know what that is. So let me talk a little bit more about that. What's that?
It's like a JKIST or inventory of services?
No, this is more fundamental within the API itself. It's not the whole inventory, but if I'm talking with a particular API and I want to be conversant with it, programmatically we need to know what that is. So in the world of WSDL, we would have created a series of operations and inputs and outputs. In the series, or in the world of OpenAPI, same thing, requests and responses. But there's a new feature called links, which I'm going to talk about. And this is the area that's kind of gotten, so Daryl Miller, Tony, and Ron, who are kind of driving a lot of the work on the 3.0 spec that just came out recently, went back and forth on this a lot with people that are saying, hey, I want this to be unknown. I want it to be determined at runtime. Well, how do you do that? Right? That's a really challenging thing to do. So I think Tony's response was great. It's like, yeah, if you have a server that knows what the conversations are going to be, but it's all dynamic, then you shouldn't be using this. That was his basic answer. And then Daryl tried to do it in a nice way. And we'll go through that in a moment. So I put a warning up here. Basically, OpenAPI, if you're using it, the 3.0, which has support for links, it focuses on static links, meaning it's known in advance. So if you're, as an architect, going to build and say, here is the flow, and here are how the links are going to look, then you can go ahead and do that. So from a history perspective, the request for links came from our partner, Atlassian. So Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, if you ever use those tools. They wanted to create an API for Bitbucket. But with Bitbucket, because you are using a Git repo, you don't want to express all the commits and the merges and all that stuff in a single response. It's way too big. And we heard about that earlier with video on demand. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to compress it from what I read, and they wanted to use hyperlinks to help facilitate that, to point you down the right paths, and only if you wanted to get that information can you go ahead and do that. So it's kind of like, a notion of like a claim check pattern. You leave the big data someplace and you give them a claim check and you collect it when you want it, and here's the link to go ahead and do that. So kind of the history, I think, comes out of Atlassian requesting that. So links were put in, but they knew in advance what the structure was going to be because they own the product and the flow of the data and the interactions. But if you don't own that, then it becomes more challenging. So the top one, if you know in advance and you can define that flow, those series of hyperlinks and the interactions, you can use something called links, which is new in 3.0. If you don't know that, and it's dynamically generated, and we're truly really trying to represent what Roy had put together in his dissertation, which is the hypermedia tells you where to go, and the client has to be intelligent enough to do that, just like we're talking here, then you're not going to be looking at OpenAPI. And in fact, as Tony mentioned, you're not going to be using OpenAPI at all because it's self-documenting. The application will tell you what to do. So you don't need to have something that prescribes it. At least that's his perspective. And I obviously respect Tony and his perspective because he put this thing together to begin with. So here's the infamous issue number 577. So if you want to learn more about this, you can read through the very long discussion. I think Darryl Miller at the end was like, I'm done. I can't tell you in any different way how to use this. But at the end, I think it's basically, again, if you know, static links is an option. If you don't, and it's dynamic, then you're going to stay away from this. And you probably will not use OpenAPI to the full extent. You may provide the higher level aspects, but then out of band, tell the developer, hey, here's some examples of how it could interact. So you can take a look at that and read through that. So this is unfortunate, got cut off a little bit, but here's an example if you've never seen links before. So the difference in this response is a lot of people are familiar with getting some kind of JSON payload back, which this is. But this is also giving you information in relation to other places you can go. So the one example that we provided yesterday was quite often I'll see in a post is a mechanism by which we create some type of state. And once I've created a customer or a reservation, what you probably would want to do is return that back to the person that asked for that to be created. Kind of like a claim check again. Here's where it's at. Here's the URL if you decide you want to traverse to that. And a lot of applications, as you think about it, whether it's Angular, React, or other, when you're in that reservation process and you filled it out and you said post, submit the reservation, what's the first thing that comes back? Well, it's a page with the reservation ID, and it's usually a hyperlink that you can click on to then go and look at that reservation detail if you wanted to change it or other. So if, a post-get combination is quite often what we see when using links in this particular example. So we have, for maybe you want to get the order, 523. Well, where's the order located? What's that warehouse 56? And what's the invoice related to this overall order? Well, it's 873. So all these links in this HAL format, which is a standard, and this is what Bitbucket is using, allows you to look at more interesting information. But again, this is known in advance in this particular example. Okay, so how would we do linking? I'll just kind of cover this at a high level. So linking within 3.0, which did not exist in the 2.0 spec, occurs within, in this case, the response. So what's hard to see here is there's a response with a 200, and this is me like creating a user or whatever, and I'm saying, hey, when I create that user, there's a link, and we're going to link it to some type of value, some type of information. Is it going to be in the header? Where is this this particular URL, for instance, going to exist, or the link going to exist? Is it in the body, the header? Where can I find it? So we want to articulate that. So in the response, it's just saying, hey, there's going to be a link. And then separate from that, there's a new section in OpenAPI called components, and that sweeps under the rug definitions and schemes and links and responses and parameters, a bunch of stuff. So under components, you can create a link definition. In the link definition, you have the ability to then articulate where in the response the information will appear. And also to be able to link, well, what is the operation they want to use this information that follows? So in this case, hey, if I'm going to give you the owner of the repo, then there should be a get for that repository owner in this particular case, or get repo on the bottom side. So if we go forward again here, then On the right side, we have then another operation, which is now a get. And in that, it can refer to its own links that it may return, as well as the ability to pull out and use as an input to the call the username. So if you think about it, when the post is created and the link comes back, I want to pull that link data out and then use it as a correlation ID to then perform the next call. So however the API is structured to then handle that, in this case, as a path parameter, it's going to be fired in. But the origination of that came from me defining a link on the response, correlating where it was located, and then referring to it within the parameters. So this gives you a richer mechanism, I guess you could say. But again, the challenge is I have to know all this stuff in advance. What happens if the data doesn't show up in the body? Well, then this doesn't work, right? What happens if it's in the header? Or what happens if it's in a different naming structure? What if I don't know what the links are going to look like? That's the challenge. And that's a challenge that has existed even before REST. So in the world of SOAP, when we were building SOAP services, we always had the challenge of creating contracts that were either forward compatible. That was the wish by a lot of companies. Hey, you just keep adding stuff to it, and it's so generic that you can traverse it yourself and find it, and you'll never break compatibility with the client. And that was really difficult to create. And if you did do it, it was so generic that you couldn't figure out what the heck you were looking at from a contract perspective. So forward compatibility is really kind of where hypermedia engine state. You have to have a client that's cognizant of how to navigate this information. Whereas here, we're actually saying, we know what the situation is, this is what we're doing, this is how it's going to be represented. So it's not truly a level 3, maybe it's a level 2+. It's kind of in between, right? It's getting there, but it's not there yet. So I think when looking at this in general, I think from a practice perspective, what we find is that level 2 is really where OpenAPI shines. And if you want to start including a little bit of kind of this hypermedia navigation mechanism, you could take advantage of static links to do that. But for some of the team members that were, or the persons that were attending the training yesterday, that may not be the case, right? So links may not make the most sense, and rather what you may do is use external docs or other to communicate the fact that, hey, here's an API definition, but there's a lot more going on under the scenes. And you have to have a client, and maybe let's give you a sample client that can do that traversal for you. Kind of like Lorinda said, give you sandboxes, give you examples, give you SDKs, whatever, to help you fulfill what it is that you need to do. But I think in practice, I've been working with Cap One, Citibank, Guardian Insurance, and others, a lot in the fintech space. A lot of people don't have a lot of time to think about all those specifics, so it seems like they're sticking with level 2 for the most part, and really thinking about using OpenAPI to define that, and the richness of that is available there through that, unless there's certain use cases where the data sets are large and it makes more sense to provide links back that then can refer you to where maybe the resources that you need to access or that state that you need to access at that point in time. So in practice, level 2, starting, we're trying to get there with level 3 with this static links capability. Like I said, issue 577, take a look at that. A lot of interesting conversations around different use cases and challenges that go with that. And you'll realize it's not a simple answer. And I think Tony's is the simplest, which is like, yeah, don't even use this if you're going to have a true, Roy Fielding level 3 type of scenario. Okay, summary. In general, OpenAPI, for what I've been using it for, is very, very helpful because at a minimum it communicates what it is that you're trying to do through the API. But more importantly, everything is moving to code. So your API definition can now be code. I can put it into GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever. My infrastructure is a code. I use Docker, so Docker files. Jenkins, pipelines, everything is moving to code. The value of that is version control, merging, PRs, design reviews, et cetera. So if you think about it, you can create everything that you decide to build nowadays in that form, store it, manage it, and have a good life cycle to go with it, as we saw earlier. And from that, I think out of all of them, this is the one that's won. At this point in time, I don't think there's any other. There's Blueprints and there was Waddle. Nobody's using that. Blueprints, there's a small percentage. Raml, I think, was one that was out there, but they've given up now. So I think Tony and their team have done a good job. And based on the adoption by Cap One and the Googles and Microsoft, et cetera, we're seeing a good uptick in people applying this. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful. It's a very dry topic, but I just want to make you aware of it. If you're going to 3, that there's only so much you can do. and you really need to do a little more research on that, and more likely than not, you'll probably stick with it at a level 2 layer. If you're going level 3, have a different series of external docs and clients that can help your people get through that. Great. Thank you. Any questions on that? There's actually questions? I thought you guys were going to be like, bolt for the door and get the hell out of here. It's a long couple days for you guys, training and then this.
Actually,
That's or take a left.
Well, you got to ask me anything at 3:30.
Sorry.
The question is actually not, it's related to the topic, but not something you covered
That's fine.
explicitly.
Go ahead.
Which is polymorphism, and how do you expect, I mean, how is it, have you seen it used? And if so, beyond the spec itself, right? So in real life.
Yeah.
And different ways in which you think, good ways to make use of polymorphism and bad ways.
Okay, so on the polymorphism front, I've seen more of it on the SOAP side, but we're starting to see some of it on the REST side now, where people are trying to make contracts that are more reflective of how data could change. Most of the APIs that we've seen are relatively, I'll say, simple. They don't typically have a data architect associated with it, where you would hear a lot of that. Hey, we're going to have a class, and we want the system to be able to handle all these different styles or classes of data. How would we go about that? So there has been some work recently in the 3.0, and I kind of mentioned that yesterday with regard to updates in JSON schema that help with some of that. But in terms of impracticality with people that I'm working with, most people are creating kind of a very flat, very simple data sets for the most part. REST is great when you're sending smaller payloads, but as you get larger, it's not as efficient. So when we see larger payloads or bigger data sets, then we typically see those going to more messaging styles of systems. And then we're not seeing a Swagger doc because they may be just workers that are consuming a payload. Maybe they're written in Scala, for instance, and they have nothing to do with a REST interface.
Why would you say that REST is not as efficient for larger payloads? What is it about REST?
Yeah, so in terms of if you're dealing with, for instance, we heard video, right? So you could attach video as a MIME attachment to a REST call, but is that the most efficient way to move it to the consumer? It may not be. When we're dealing with, I used to work at PTC down the street, I mentioned that yesterday, when you're dealing with a gigabyte in CAD data, I'm more likely not going to push that over HTTP. I could stream it, and people are trying to do that, but more likely what I would do is provide a reference to it and then let somebody consume it after the fact.
So you're talking about REST or large payloads in terms of like video size,
yeah,
not in terms of complex objects that are less
not the
than 10K.
complex object. It's more the physical size of the data, right? And then it's also ETL, right? When I do ETL type processes, I don't use HTTP to move the data. You're typically moving over faster networks and using SANs and things of that nature to move it. So that was kind of my perspective on the large data size. But in terms of complexity, the majority of teams that I've seen, and this I think this is in practice, and this is even a Cap 1, teams have gotten a lot smaller, and individuals have to do more. There's less architecture exposure. So having a really good data architect that can really look at the business entities and the domains that people are defining are becoming rarer and rarer, which means that the developers are given charge to say, what does the API look like and how am I going to build it? Oh, and it has to be done in 2 weeks. So there's very little time to think and create a clean design. It's usually build it, get out the door, and then iterate and iterate and iterate. And as mentioned earlier, trash it if it doesn't work and make a new one. So I think the reality is polymorphism and using more complex data structures within the definitions. Those occur in organizations that have been iterating for a while on a particular API and have identified that the consumer needs that type of information, but at a first stab, we don't usually see that. It's usually a very simple flat model, and then it evolves. So I think with the new features on JSON schema, you get more towards that so that you can support, I talked a little bit about this yesterday in terms of different classes of objects. I think we'll see more additions over time to that to allow you to support more inheritance. So in the days of schema, we'd have an XSD any, and then I could incorporate some base template capabilities and then enhance that or extend it with more capabilities. And I think that's kind of what you're kind of leaning towards. How do I support that with an OpenAPI? So JSON schema enhancements of that will allow us to get there. And some of the capabilities like any of, none, et cetera, give some capabilities in that area, but they're not to the point where I think it gives you the richness that you need. So the other option is that you could pass the data as an attachment or use a different MIME type. and then figure out is there an alternative that you could use and package as part of the communication. But now when you move away from JSON, it makes it more difficult for the UI developer to consume that because now they have to serialize. And we talked about XML yesterday, like, that was a hassle because now the UI developer has to serialize that into a JavaScript definition or other. So we typically try to keep it as simple as you can. If the data gets very complicated, then is there a means by which another MIME type or an alternative way of describing it that can be done outside of JSON schema, maybe even using XML as an example, because XML has done that and supports that.
If your data is complicated, then maybe the resources you have are not the resources you
It could be too. I mean, it could be the sizing of the resources. I mean, I think Lorinda showed kind of a granularity thing, like a Swift ID service, but now it's more of a higher level, coarse-grained service. So it may be the sizing of the service too. You may be trying to take too much on in that one service, so maybe breaking it up into smaller, finer-grained services. That's really difficult, and the only way you figure that out is usually in practice, is running into the problem and then saying, okay, the data is really complex. Do we need to break the data apart? And if we break the data apart, then really there should be separate resources potentially. And maybe that makes it simpler, but now I got to compose them. So the complexity either goes up or down. You can't get rid of it. It just depends on how you decide to manipulate and deal with it.
I think as you break it apart, though, you'll find what we found out, that it makes it easier to consume for your clients, right? Because you broke it out, now I only need this data, and I'm not expected to get this huge amount of data.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it could be the granularity. That may be another approach architecturally to look at it. So I think, long story short, there are some features that are starting to come in to support some of the capabilities I think you need. If you don't find that they're a different MIME type, and using older standards could be a way to do it, but then now you're pushing the complexity onto the front-end developer to deal with that potentially. Maybe it's a service granularity thing. Hey, let's take a look at the service. Maybe we break it up into a few services, simpler data models, and then we compose it. I know you guys are talking about GraphQL, for instance, right? So using tools like that to maybe aggregate it across a few different smaller services and then represent back up. But there's always complexity, and the question is, where does the complexity rise? Does it go up? Orchestration layer, is it in the service? Is it in the data? And then who has to deal with it on the UI side? You always want to make it, I think, if I took anything out of Lorinda's talk, it's make it as simple as possible for the consumer, because if it isn't, then they won't use it, and they're going to chew your ear off about it. So look at it from their perspective and say, if I were to build a front end, how can I simplify it and make it easier and easier and easier and easier so that it's, so for them, it's less friction, it's frictionless, right? I think that would be something to think about. But, so some capabilities, but there's, I think, more to come. Any other questions?
Could you go back to your
Sure.
3.0 example for a second?
Which one was it, 0?
3.0? They're just 2 slides back. Is it 2 or 3? Keep going. There.
Yep.
So as a hack, and get you maybe a little bit closer, could you make your link to, instead of just making your link to the specific service you want, make your link to get next client's link? So then the link would be held in a memory object, and the link could be dynamic based on the service it was just in, and it got put into that object or into a database.
Yeah, the link can be really, whatever, it's data, right? So whatever the data is that you want to represent, and how does that then resolve to the next call is up to you. And then you can also extend, right? You can always use the X option in OpenAPI or Swagger to create whatever it is that you want. I think from their perspective, they're trying to figure out how do we create something generic that everybody can use, that supports all use cases, and that's the issue. Right now we can't. Right, everybody's in how they implement. I can write a piece of code that does something and provides a similar service to you, but we build in completely different ways, and how the hyperlinks look, the structuring of the JSON, all that could be different. So it's really up to you as to how you want to implement it. There's this links capability now that you can leverage to statically define the next thing, and whatever that next thing may be, to help you locate it, identify the value of that, share that value. That's up to you to identify. So this is more of you architecting what that flow is going to look like, and you can use links to then connect operations with data. Whatever the data is up to you.
I'm just saying that in the link itself, if the link went, because it's just going to another API. I mean, that's all it's doing.
Yeah,
right?
it's giving
So-
you a reference.
Right, so if you hit that API and the API actually provides you with the link and maybe it redirects you automatically to the service
Sure.
using your same claim check pattern,
Yep.
you get closer to that conversation.
Yeah, you could do that as well. You could just use that to redirect, let the redirection manage where you're actually going to go based on data that's placed into the URL. So there's a wide range of ways you can do that. You could use middleware, ESBs and others. We've heard some of that technology earlier today. I've been looking at solutions from Lyft called Envoy. So there are other proxying technologies that can help facilitate some of that as well. So there's hardware, there's software, there's cloud stuff, a variety of ways. But within the definition, I think this is meant to just give you a design time perspective. And that, again, when it's runtime generated, we don't know what it's going to be. So you try to put as much as you can, or just remove it entirely and then just external dock it out to, hey, here's our sandbox, here are our examples, here's our client that demonstrates it. So we get the base stuff here, but for the hypermedia, take a look at the code to see how it actually moves through it. And that's what I've seen more people doing, going to that level versus docking it. Okay. All right.